Hey, I do want to thank you for doing the conversation thing. That's another thing that I know, depending on your personality style and how comfortable you are with fellow crosswalkers, you might hate that portion. Oh, we got to talk. I know, but it's really important, and we don't really do it enough. I mean, it's the weirdest thing, but we live in a connected society, and yet we don't connect with each other well, and that's how we feel cared for and all that. By the way, I want to bring you just a brief update on somebody that has been on the prayer list for some time, Debbie Fothery. Debbie and Peyton, they've been coming here, I don't know, a handful of years, 3 years, yeah. And last November, she was diagnosed with a very aggressive brain tumor. And because the treatment and everything she was going through, they just checked out. They had to rest and just to fight this thing. And so I've been keeping tabs on them, and so are the Pagodas, dear friends. And, they got a little bit of a win in terms of some of the treatment as this helps some, but just keep them in your prayers. And if you think of it, send them a note, especially if you've been through this kind of thing. I think it would mean a lot to them. And sometimes, we don't know it's okay to intrude, so to speak, with love and care, but I think it'd be a great thing. So please do that, and feel free to do that. So when we look at today's stuff, this is one of those passages where just walking through it, I'm just going to walk through it slowly with you and take a look at a few things. But this is an example, and actually when I speak in 2 weeks from now on a related passage to this, it's sort of not quite on the end of Jacob's story, but a lot happens in between what we're looking at today and what we're looking at in 2 weeks. These two passages in particular, if you're just going into it with no helps, no resources, there's so much that is right in front of our noses that we don't even see. And this is one of those passages that sometimes if we take our time and just take a look for what's there, we find out that there was more there all along. And so that's what I want to do with you. And we just remember here that as we take a look at this text, especially in Genesis, this is not just an interesting story to pass down to the kids. This is a story of a whole nation and their formation. And they are trying to proclaim a message about the God that they have been experiencing as a people to the rest of the world and as a reminder to each other. And this particular book probably came to fruition, although the stories would have been circulating for some time. A couple different camps of authors finally put it together somewhere around 800 years or so before Jesus was born. So you had this massive oral tradition where people are remembering it, and then two different camps, or actually if you want to call them two different schools, came together. The Yahwists and the Elohimists, if you want to call them that. Those were the camps who came together to put this thing in print for us. And we've been looking at it ever since. So as we think about it, we're talking more than just about Jacob. We're talking about a whole people and what they're seeing and learning about God over time. And so just remember from what I talked about last week, we had kind of part one of the swindling happen last week, where Jacob suckers his brother Esau out of his birthright and gets him to take an oath for a bowl of soup. Now, probably Esau didn't take all that very seriously. He was thinking, well, who cares what I do? It's up to Dad. Well, then later on in the story, if you go back and read it, Jacob swindles the birthright out of his father's mouth, and he does it with trickery. His dad can't see, and so with his mom's help, because remember, Jacob was favored by mom, Esau favored by dad, and that certainly screwed all kinds of things up. And so Jacob's mother helped him smell like Esau. He was fairly, shower averse, perhaps we might say. Very hairy guy, so he literally put on some goat skin. That's a pretty hairy dude. And brought in some food that he, perhaps caught, and made it for Dad. And then got the blessing from his father, Isaac. Robbed it right out from Esau's, right under his nose. Now you got to remember that Esau was a hunter. He was really good with a bow. He was good with a knife. Probably fought bears, who knows. But this was a rough and tumble guy. And Jacob just royally ripped him off. How do you think Esau's feeling right now? just a little bit upset. And so, Jacob, after swindling out his brother, left Beersheba and went to Haran. Why do you think he would leave? Duh, right? Of course. And he didn't just go like from here to Vallejo, right? I mean, this is like the distance between here and LA. And he doesn't have a car. This is on foot. So he's 400 miles away. That's sort of ballpark what we're talking about. This is a long way away. There's no way that he's going to make chase after him, right? So he is putting as much distance as possible because he knows if he doesn't, he's dead. And so that's what he's doing. He's on his way. He's literally running for his life. He sort of, scored the inheritance. And by the way, the inheritance, if you're not as familiar with the ancient practice on that, so two things would happen. One is he'd become the head of the household. So you're calling the shots on the estate. But then the way the inheritance rights worked back then is the oldest son got twice as much as every other son. So he doubled his inheritance and became the guy in charge when his dad would die. I mean, that would tick anybody off, right? And he swindled it right out of him. He is a trickster, and we got to understand that that's who Jacob is. His name means heel, and that was a reference because he was grabbing the heel of his brother as he was coming out of the womb. So this is part of his DNA, and he's going to wrestle with this for many years until we come back in 2 weeks and take a look at what happens. So he's on his way to Haran. He came to a certain place and camped for the night since the sun had set. He took one of the stones there, set it under his head, and lay down to sleep because he forgot his inflatable mattress and pillow. Real hard. And he dreamed. Now, you and I have dreams, and sometimes they're really weird dreams about, you wearing whatever clothing or not clothing, and who knows where you are, what you're doing. And we wake ourselves up in the middle of the night, and we realize it was just bad sushi or something, right? But back then, if you had a powerful dream, a very powerful dream, it was not lost on you. And you mined it for whatever it had to give you because you assumed that in that powerful dream, the gods were trying to tell you something. And this was no exception. This is one wacky dream, at least the way we think about it, not as wacky for him. So he dreamed. A stairway was set on the ground, and it reached all the way to the sky. Angels of God were going up and going down on it. Now, you and I would think about a ladder reaching up to the sky, and we'd think, well, that's a weird dream. Why would you read? Why that? And if we're not paying attention, we don't realize that we're dealing with an ancient cosmology here. So you have a different way of thinking about God here, where they thought in their world that God literally was above, way above, up in the heavens, and that our presence here and our life here was separated literally by a hammered out dome that we would look at and call the sky way up there. And God lived above that dome up there. And whenever we felt the rain coming, it was simply because God opened up the hatch and let some water out. That's the ancient cosmology. And we laugh, but if you put yourself back in that time, it kind of makes sense. And so it makes sense then that as he's having this dream, he realizes he must be in like a portal kind of a space. You know what I mean? Because all of a sudden he is seeing this ladder go all the way up to the heavens. And angels are going up and down this thing. So the dream makes sense to him. This is not bad sushi. This is cosmology. And that's how he sees the world. But then a very peculiar thing happens. Then God, two things, all in the first part of this sentence. Then God was right before him. You and I read this, and we're like, oh, what happens next? Not in the ancient world. Because God doesn't come down from the heavens. God stays up there where God belongs. God doesn't want to come down because the way the gods look at us, if you're in the primitive mind, is we're babies, we're toddlers with soiled diapers. We're crying all the time, we stink, and they don't want to be bothered with cleaning us up. That's kind of the attitude a lot of the primitive thinking had back in that day. God stay up there. They don't come down here. But in this story, in this very powerful dream, in this portal place, Jacob has this experience where not the angels come to him, but God comes to him. And don't miss that. And then right after that, then God was right before him saying. Now again, don't rush ahead to the other thing there, but get the point. Don't miss the point. That this is God talking. And that was very unusual back then. God doesn't come down, and God does not lower God's self to talk to mere mortals. So back up the truck a second. Remember what this book is all about. It's about beginnings. It's about proclaiming a way of thinking about God, interacting with God that people have been experiencing for a very long time. And the communication that is being put forward. And this isn't the first time this has happened. This is similar with Abraham as well, where God shows up in personal form and speaks. So the communication is starting to come clear. The God that we have found as the Jewish people, the Hebrew people, the people of Israel, is a God who comes down from heaven and comes right beside us and speaks. Now, interesting little Hebrew text note here. I was talking to Curtis Thornton, who loves to study the Bible and has done a lifetime of work doing that. And I was telling him, he's coming back from a walk just as he was leaving. And I said, oh man, I just came across this interesting research on this particular word. Because this particular word in Hebrew, they're not quite sure how to translate it. Because the word could mean above, or it could mean beside. And so some of your Bible translations, if we just pulled those, or if we pulled the app up on your phone, you would notice that this particular passage, if you were to go to, say, the NIV, it was going to say, then God was above him, saying. But then if you go to something like the New Revised Standard Version, it's going to say, but then God was beside him, or next to him. The Hebrew isn't super clear. And that's why I picked this one, because the message, and Eugene Peterson, who's his own biblical scholar in his own right, sometimes he's the only one that gets it quite exactly right. And so you have God who is above, yes, everywhere, but also beside Jacob at the same time. Just an interesting little thing there, and just realize how significant that is in the ancient world. And he speaks. This God speaks. I am God, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. I'm giving the ground on which you are sleeping to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will be as the dust of the earth. They'll stretch from west to east and from north to south. All the families of the earth will bless themselves in you and your descendants. In other words, the whole world is going to be blessed by what you're proclaiming and what you're doing with this relationship we have. Yes, I'll stay with you. I'll protect you wherever you go, and I'll bring you back to this very ground. I'll stick with you until I've done everything I promised you. Now, this should sound somewhat familiar if you've been following along in the past few weeks as we've been trucking through Genesis, because this sounds very familiar to what Abraham also heard from God, doesn't it? I mean, it's almost verbatim. You know why? Because it is verbatim. It's because God is wanting to continue the blessing through Jacob and make that totally clear to him. That the thing I started with Abraham, got going through your dad, I'm going to continue with you. But I think I missed a line here. Let me just back up here. Okay, so yes, I'll stay with you. I'll protect you wherever you go, and I'll bring you back to this very ground. I'll stick with you until I've done everything I promised you. Oh, here it is. But I'm only going to do this stuff if you obey the rules, if you're a good person, if you vote correctly, and if you wear cool clothes. Does your version have that? Apparently I made that up. You know what's fascinating about this? There's all kinds of stuff that's going on here. The first interesting thing here is Jacob, he's running for his life. But the way the storyteller gives this story to us, you never see Jacob have a church service. He doesn't make a little altar. He doesn't even say a bedtime prayer. We don't have any record of Jacob lifting up his hand saying, God help me. I just totally ripped off my brother, and it would be super cool if you could just protect me, for a little while until I get a little more distance between us. He doesn't do that. He doesn't say anything like, hey, God, hey, really sorry for that whole business I just concocted back there. That was really, well, that was awful, wasn't it? I mean, I really had him going there. But now it's mine, so I guess you kind of have to stick with me on that. There's no confession. There's no call for God's presence. There's no prayer whatsoever. The reason that's significant is because the story that's being communicated by the Jewish people is that God initiates this whole thing. It's not us screaming out and then God saying, okay, I guess. No. It's God taking the first step. Seeing Jacob there, knowing what went down, and saying to Jacob long before, in fact, there's no indication whatsoever that Jacob is even held accountable for his trickery. Which means that all the things that God is saying about what God wants to do through him is unconditional. How do you like that? I'll tell you how you like that. You don't like that. You like it for you, but you don't like it for Lauren Haas. Because Lauren Haas has been up to no good, as we all know. And we don't want God to do anything good for him, because while God may be unconditional in God's love for us, there's a serious list of concerns for Lauren Haas. While God may be totally fine with me, not so for Sal Nuccio. Not so for women. Not so for immigrants. Not so for Muslims. Not so for gay people. Big, big list. Yeah, here we don't have that. We have a guy that clearly has character issues, who has done something terribly wrong. Everybody sees it. Nobody is denying it. He's done something horrible, and yet in no way does God pre-qualify his covenant, his promise, with any of that kind of condition. He just says, this is what I'm going to do. This is who I am. And this is what I'm trying to do in the whole world. I started this thing with Abraham, and Abraham got some things wrong, by the way. I continued with Isaac, and Isaac got some things wrong, by the way, not the least of which was playing favorites with his sons and making that clearly known. And now, Jacob, I'm with you. This is what I want to do. This is what I'm about. This is where the ship is going, and I want you to come. And the whole thing is initiated by God. What do you think of that? What do you think of that? That this God that the Jewish people are talking about, their beginning story, is they're saying to you that God comes to you. God comes to us. And God's got an agenda, but the agenda is good. And the agenda is to bless, to be with, to help you experience more beauty, more love, more joy, and not just for you, but that the whole world will be blessed through you. I don't know if I can live with that agenda, folks. Right? This is the story that's being communicated forward. God is with, God is for, God wants to bless, and he wants to do it through you. This is what's communicated through this patriarch. I think about this unconditional love thing, and how that had to have shattered a massive paradigm with Jacob, which is why he was terrified, by the way. Because you don't wake up, you don't have an experience of God face to face and live. And yet he woke up. He woke up. He had another day to live. He wasn't dead. And he recognized that he was in a holy place, that he had experienced God face to face, even though it was in a dream. And he was going to make it. And that the word that he heard was one that was positive and life-affirming and calling and inviting and not punitive. It didn't mean that he was okay with everything he did. It didn't mean that he didn't have work to do. But it meant that God came alongside even though Jacob was a fool. You know, that kind of thing takes time to really believe. When we enter into relationships, be it friendships or romantic relationships, in the early days, it's all good because we don't know each other. And the more we get to know each other, the more we get a look under the hood, so to speak. The more we see the character, whatevers, sometimes flaws, the inconsistencies. We see the humanity of the people that we're choosing to hang out with. And sometimes those friendships end because we come to a point where like, I don't need any more of that. Or I don't want any of that. And sometimes that happens in marriages too. Or things start off great, you're in this honeymoon phase, you can do no wrong in people's eyes. In fact, when Lynn and I had premarital counseling, it was just part of what you did. And, ever since then, and I think we even talked to our pastor about it then, as he kind of laughed about premarital counseling. That in a way it's kind of a joke. Because you're in this stage of your relationship. You're about to get married. Nothing is going to defeat your marriage. It's all going to be awesome. And so it's almost like every word of advice that could be given is a waste of time. Because you're so full of love and adoration for each other that you're not really in reality. So I kind of remember that when I meet with couples and offer, to work through some stuff and talk through, and most don't. For that reason. But then after you've been married a while, and the honeymoon period fades to something else, and you start to live with each other, really live with each other, and you start to get to know each other's idiosyncrasies. And this is true of deep friendships as well as romantic ones in marriage and so forth. There comes several points in time where you kind of re-up that decision. Am I still in this thing? Can we work this thing out? Because sometimes our humanity shows up in ways that we're not necessarily happy about or proud of. But when the other person looks at you and says, I'm still with you. And when you decide to go forward, and it doesn't always work out that way, but when you decide to go forward and say, I'm with you even though, there's a whole different kind of confidence level that's born out of that. And I'm just wondering what this did for Jacob, who was caught red-handed. He was a jerk. He was a jerk. He was a swindler. He knew how to work the system, and he worked it well. And yet God came alongside him and said, I want to do something in you. And I'm going to be with you. What does that seed grow into? And we know that he had a lot to learn, that the swindler gets swindled. If you want to read ahead into what happens. He met his match in his soon-to-be father-in-law. And he got swindled big time. And it caused all kinds of problems. But we're going to catch up with him in several years, in 2 weeks, and find out that he's still trying to figure this whole thing out. What does it mean that God is still with me, even though? This is who God is with us, my friends. And you may not like it because there's a strange convenience that we look at our character flaws and we look at what's wrong with us, and we use those things to do two things: to keep God at a distance and to keep ourselves distanced from God. It's like we tell ourselves, because of our flaws, God is certainly not going to come and speak to me. And so we keep God at arm's length, even though God is never at arm's length. And yet that works in a convenient way for us, because it allows us to continue on in our Jacob ways, our Jacob-ness. As we tell ourselves, God doesn't want anything to do with me because of blah, blah, blah. So we'll just keep on going in this direction. But that's not what happens here. God comes along Jacob and says, I'm with you. I'm with you. And I'm not going to leave you. There's also one other very cool thing here about this promise and about what happens next. Jacob wakes up from his sleep and he said, God is in this place, truly. And I didn't even know it. He was terrified. He whispered it on. Incredible, wonderful, holy. This is God's house. This is the gate of heaven. In other words, what happened the night before was not lost on him. He wrote it down. He remembered. He couldn't forget what had just happened. And it started to change his life. And he realized that if this thing really happened, I have to mark this moment. And you know how he marked a moment? He did exactly what you and I would do. Jacob was up first thing in the morning. He took a stone he had used for his pillow and stood it up as a memorial pillar and poured oil over it. I mean, we've all done this, haven't we? I have 6 of them in my garden in the back, all marking certain moments. We don't do this. Why did he do this? He wanted to do it because if you stand up a rock, have you ever been to, did any of you go to Tahoe? Not recently, but like a year ago when the drought was on, big time. If you went to Tahoe during the long drought, you'd look at what was supposed to be 6 foot underwater. And you could walk out on what was supposed to be underwater, and there would be all these little pillars of stone stacked up. Little monuments to the drought, because people could do that. There are other things that perhaps those meant for people who placed them there, but that's kind of what Jacob is doing, is he's taken a rock and he's making a monument of it, so that when people walk by it, they're going to be like, well, that's funny, because that rock shouldn't be standing up like that. So people would know that something had happened in this space. And then he did an additional thing to make sure that people would notice. He put oil on it. What happens to a rock when you put oil on it? Yeah, it comes to life. So you can't miss the pillar. You can't miss the marker. And so I'm wondering, have you had God show up in a particular way? Maybe God's doing that right now with you. Maybe even right now you're realizing that if this story is true, if this is right, then that means God is even with you. Even with you, with your backstory that maybe you're having a hard time with. And that the same kinds of promise, the same kinds of themes are true for you too. So how are you going to mark the moment? How are you going to remember? I bought my first cross necklace at such a time as this, where I experienced God showing up when I didn't think God should. When I thought that I was the last person that God should ever have any interest in. God showed up anyway. Not to punch me in the nose, not to shame me, not to guilt me, but to embrace and restore and to love and to say to me, I'm not through with you yet. And that was 26 years ago, 27 years ago, maybe 28 years ago. And I used some money that I had put away, and I bought a gold cross. It's not this one, it's at home. And I wore it. And I still wear a cross today because it reminds me of my Jacob moment. How have you marked the moment? Because what God does for us is beyond what we could ever expect God to do. The Apostle Paul, by the way, caught up with this. These are paradigms that are being broken all over the place, both for Jacob and then centuries and centuries later for the Apostle Paul. And so on the back side of your bulletin, or at least on the next page, there's more text. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can do that on your own. But the last paragraph, this is what Paul is saying. And remember, Paul was a guy who thought he had it all figured out. He had his religion dialed in. And then he found out that his religion wasn't the point. That religion was supposed to re-ligament. It was supposed to bring together our relationship between ourselves and God. But as often happens, people worship the religion more than they worship the God that the religion is trying to connect us to. And in a moment he couldn't forget, an eyes wide open moment, he had his life turned around by a God who shouldn't have come to welcome him into the fold. But God comes to Paul and changes his life and says, I'm not done with you yet. I got a bigger vision for you. And so let's do this thing going forward. And Paul said yes. This is what Paul says about what he understood this invitation to be about. He said, all around us, in the last paragraph of this section of Romans, all around us we observe a pregnant creation. The difficult times of pain throughout the world are simply birth pangs. But it's not only around us, it's within us. The Spirit of God is arousing us within. We're also feeling the birth pangs. These sterile and barren bodies of ours are yearning for full deliverance. That is why waiting does not diminish us, any more than waiting diminishes a pregnant mother. We are enlarged in the waiting. We, of course, don't see what is enlarging us, but the longer we wait, the larger we become, and the more joyful our expectancy. He understood there was something to be born in us, something growing in us that wasn't at our initiative, but is at the initiative of God. Something's being born in you too. Something is wanting to be fostered in you too. This is God breathing into you, God speaking into you. New life, new vision, new hope, a bigger world than just your little world, but one that actually makes a difference for the entire world. This is an invitation for you. What's your answer to this invitation? Maybe for you, it's just simply starting to realize that maybe your paradigm for who God is just way too small. That you have preferred a God that is conditional and makes you tick all the boxes before God shows up to you and just throws that out the window. And you got to deal with that. That God is for you and with you, even if you're a jerk, even if you're a Jacob, even if you messed up at 9:59 this morning, right before church. God's still with you. What are you going to do with that? And not only is God with you, but he's going to lead you forward. And by the way, the leading you forward, there's a part of you and me that does not like that. But there's a part of it we must recognize. The Hebrew word could have meant above or beside. I've been talking a lot about beside. But I want to remind you that God is also above. We think so much about good buddy Jesus being with us all the time, and yet we forget that the God who breathed life into the creation at the beginning is still breathing into creation light years away as the galaxy continues to expand. This God who continues to create, who cannot help but create, has a little better perspective on everything than you and I do. And so maybe for you, the paradigm that needs to shift is to realize that while God might be beside, God is also above. And God sees and understands and calls us from a different, bigger perspective than we can possibly have on our own. Maybe the paradigm shift for you today is to begin to listen for that higher authority in your life. To say to you, I know this is how you've been. This is how I'm inviting you to be. I know this is how you've identified yourself, but I'm encouraging you to identify yourself in a new way. You've thought about your life as being this big. I'm wanting you to see your life as this big. This is the invitation of God. I have no idea what your answer is to the question that you need to hear today. But I know that the invitation is here for you. And I invite you, as I invite myself, to say yes one more time. So let's pray together. So God, as we listen for your Spirit, give us an insight, give us a nudge, even right now. Because you are above, but you are beside as well. You're beside every one of us in this space. And I believe you're whispering into our ear, into our hearts, a word of love. You are initiating this relationship between us. And what you have to say to us is an invitation to believe something new about you and about ourselves that maybe we haven't believed before. Somehow nudge us, God. What is it that you want us to hear today? What do we need to remember? What do we need to go forward with? Folks, I encourage you in prayer just now in your silence to try to identify what's one thing from this story of Jacob that has been impactful for you, that might help you in your journey going forward? What did you need to hear today from this story? Because I think God's present in it. Take a moment in silence and figure it out. So God, you invite us in similar ways and different ways. And now you pause, awaiting our response. Your invitation will remain, even if we say no. Your invitation will always remain. But now you take pause to hear from us. So congregation, from what you've been invited into, what is your response to God today? God, some of us, it's a decision to believe that you are good and that you are present and you are with us. For some of us, it is to really believe that you're a God who looks past our shortcomings, and you're not a God who's interested in shaming and guilting us to death. And for some of us, God, it's good news that not only do you show up, but you don't kill us. And we wake up to a new day. And so maybe today, God, you're inviting us to mark the moment, because we haven't yet. And for all of us, God, you're calling us to something bigger and greater. Not from our limited 2017 perspective, but from one that is eternal and ongoing and beautiful and life-giving. To that invitation, to be blessed in order to be a blessing, may we say yes. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Before we sing this final